Chapter 45.
Possessed in Opak.
Matthew 10, verse 8. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, freely you have received, freely give. We were in church one morning, and
Opak.
their singing in that church always blessed me. As I have said before, it was like going to Africa. This day, a woman was there that began acting stranger and stranger as the worship in church became better and better. Suddenly, she was on the floor doing all sorts of contortions. This was clearly not a seizure. I was familiar with them. If you have ever watched anything about possession or exorcism, you would clearly put this in that category. People in Haiti are used to voodoo. This was not new to them. The church kept singing and worshiping and led by a little ancient lady with a Bible in hand. A group surrounded the woman doing bizarre things on the floor. They began hollering and waving their Bibles in the air. They were hollering at the spirit, not the woman, ordering it to leave in the name of Jesus. Then the little old lady began beating the woman with her Bible and demanding that the spirit leave. At one point, the crowd around her seemed to sense that the spirit was about to leave. In a flowing, orderly motion, without being told, they opened a clear pathway to the church door for the spirit to leave through. And the woman quickly became quite normal. We attended a church service shortly after that. That same woman from the floor was singing and worshiping with a beautiful voice. Chapter 46. The Wedding. John 2, verse 1 and 2. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. We were sitting talking to the pastor of the La'akul church one day about baptism. To be a full member of the church, you had to be baptized. The church would not baptize a person until they were living a life obedient to Christ. As we talked, we learned that there were many faithful believers in the church that were not baptized. They were not baptized because they were not married. They had been faithful to their mates and raised families, but they were not married, and the church would not baptize them. I asked the logical next question: why weren't they married? To us, the answer was ridiculous. Social and church customs dictated that you could only get married in a grand formal ceremony. This required full wedding dress and a reception to which all the community must be invited for a celebration meal. These people could not feed themselves, let alone throw a party for the community. The church community was very firm on these issues, and the result was a failure in the system that excluded the poorest in the community from church membership. So we did the unthinkable. We would throw a mass wedding, and all those who were in the church that were excluded from baptism because of not being married could be a part of this grand wedding. As a part of this grand wedding, we would supply all the food required for the wedding banquet. The following week, there would be baptisms on the beach. The couples got excited about it all and begged and borrowed wedding clothes. The result was an incredible sight with brides and grooms lined up to take their vows. It was a successful venture and a unique experience.
Chapter 47.
Gonaveve's War Zone Re-Entry. Psalm 23, verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. We were coming back into Haiti for what we believed would be our last time. We were in our 7th year. When God had called us to Haiti, it had been clear that it was for a 7-year period. During our absence in Florida, things in Haiti had continued to spiral downhill. Things were clearly not right when we pulled into Gonaves to clear customs. Normally, there were people everywhere, but on this occasion, the town seemed relatively deserted. Eventually, a boat rowed out to us with the men in it who knew me and usually helped Pastor August, the customs agent, get out to the boat. They explained that most of the officials had fled the city due to the riots. There were no customs and immigration officials, and the office was closed up. They did know, however, of a policeman who was not working but was staying at a place in town. If I prepared the paperwork the way that Pastor August used to, they would bring me to the policeman who would stamp it to show that I had entered the country legally. Reluctantly, I went with the guys to shore, leaving my family alone on the boat. The streets were like a war zone, with barricades strewn across the roads and burned out fires everywhere. Gonaves was known for its civil unrest. It always seemed to be the center or the beginning of things when they came apart in the country. If this was a sign of things to come in Haiti this year, it would be a challenging year indeed. They took me to the middle of town, through and around all the barricades, until we got to where the policeman was hiding out. For a few dollars, he completed the last parts of all the paperwork and stamped us into the country. I got back to the boat as quickly as I could, and we pulled anchor and were on our way. Often we would anchor off the salt flats for the night in a far corner of the bay, away from everything. But with the conditions we saw in town, we thought it best to get out of the area and headed directly for Ibo to let everyone know that we were back in country. Earlier in this tale, I referred to Gonaves as one of the armpits of this world. My first visit to the town had been by carb back in 1995. I didn't like the town then, and I liked it even less each time I was there. Gonaves was in a very dry part of Haiti. There were salt ponds all around the shoreline. They would flood the salt pans with salt water and let it evaporate, leaving the salt. They would keep repeating this process until a thick layer of salt built up that they could harvest. Because it was dry and windy, it was also dusty. The salt harvested here was a shade of brown rather than white, and you could recognize it all over the country. The poorest of this town lived on the waterfront, and it was a mess. They were trying to make more land by dumping all the local trash on the shoreline. So many of the slum huts literally were built on the garbage. It smelled horrible. Things would in fact be different for us this year. There would be no groups and visitors, as the risk was too high. Visiting groups were normally a source of funding for us, so no groups would present funding issues in a year that we were trying to bring things to completion. Even buying fuel for the boat would become more difficult. Fuel was imported and paid for by the government. The oil companies would not unload their tankers until they were paid in full. The country's fuel reserve was 2 or 3 days. When you combine these facts, it took little going wrong for fuel supplies to dry up, and it did regularly. Like fuel, the country's rice supply became less stable. This happened at a time rice prices were going through the roof. Chapter 48. Under Attack. 2 Kings 6, verse 16. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. There was a pro-President Aristide gang that lived in a local area. The children of the gang members went to our school and were fed there. This is one of the reasons that our school remained open while most of the schools in Haiti were closed. This gang, known as Dome Nanboy, which means sleep in the woods, was supported by Aristide as one of his enforcing units. Their weapons were supplied through Aristide, but as he slowly slipped from control of the country, opposing gangs started becoming more visible and brazen and began to strike out at the Aristide gangs. One day I was working at the school. The rest of the family was on the boat, and I was alone with some Haitians working with me. Suddenly, one of the Haitians from outside the school came running in and hollering for me to run and get back to the boat as fast as I could. At that moment, automatic gunfires started just down the road and was coming my way. A gang that was opposing Dome Namboy was attacking the village. There was automatic weapon fire everywhere, it seemed. As I ran down the road toward the boat, calling the boat as I went, they could hear the gunfire, so there was no need to explain the urgency. Jordan was in the skiff heading my way as fast as he could. He was 13 years old and was coming as fast as he could directly towards the gunfire. A boy that age shouldn't be in that situation, but Jordan was calm and confident. I came out of the brush area and onto the beach. Jordan met me partway along the shoreline, and I jumped into the boat as he backed off the beach and headed for the main boat. From the main boat, we could see part of what was happening. Fires were everywhere as the gang went through town, burning houses down. Black smoke was pouring out of the jungle everywhere around where our school was, and we were unable to tell if the school or the huts around it were being burned. The fires and the gunfire came closer to the shoreline where we were anchored. We had rigged the anchor chain with a safety line to be able to shed the anchor and chain in 30 seconds, dropping the anchor chain on a buoyed line, freeing the boat in an emergency. Due to the conditions in Haiti and our experience in Corral, we had decided to be prepared. We had the engines running and ready to drop the anchor chain and run. But as the gangs came down the waterfront, burning huts, they stopped short of the beach straight off the boat, and we felt secure in staying rather than running. The gunfire eventually came to an end, and the burning huts burned themselves out. We headed back into the village to see what had happened. The school had been spared from the fires, but about 20 homes had been burned to the ground. The gangs had arrived with containers of gas to burn the houses of anyone they believed was associated with the Sleep in the Woods gang members, who were now actually living in the woods. None of them had been caught, but their families lost their homes. By this time, many of the missionaries in Haiti had already been evacuated out of the country. Both the U.S. and Canadian embassies had advised all citizens to leave the country. We had been in discussion with Free Ed, Charlie at the mission by Lagone, and Clean Water for Haiti over the last few weeks, and had developed an emergency evacuation plan of our own. If the conditions in the country got to an abandoning point, we would do a circle out of the country by picking up people on the way out and would head to either Jamaica or Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. We would all check in with each other daily to see how the others were doing. It was a challenging time, but we all felt we needed to stay to do our jobs as long as we could. After the attack on the village of La Acole, things continued downhill politically as the people turned against Aristide. For security reasons, we took our beat-up old truck to Fried's happy house in Petit Gouvet. He had high concrete block walls and a solid steel gate, so the truck would be safer there than parked exposed in La Cour. After getting the truck put away safely, the plan was to stay close to the boat. Things were just too unstable to go anywhere. The problem now was my family was alone on the boat, and I was in
T-Glove.
Some rioting protests had begun in the main town. We could hear the gunfire. Mano had a small motorcycle given to him through a Christian Motorcycle Association project to help pastors in third world countries get around. He and I jumped on the mobs and find a way through while avoiding being shot at. We got through, and I got back to the boat. Mano went to our church in La Cour and stayed there with the bike. Chapter 49, The Fall of Aristide. Psalm 27, verse 5. For in the day of trouble he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock. The day had to come. It was late February 2004, and we were all confined on board. Our friends were all locked into their various mission compounds. We were all pretty close to pulling the pin and about to do our evacuation run. The country was a time bomb about to explode. The final move was made by the U.S. They did not want our civil war with massive loss of life this close to home. The refugees fleeing to Florida by boat were already a growing problem. The U.S. military helicopters came in and gave Aristide little option about leaving. They took him out of the country quickly. The next thing that occurred was that any remaining policemen fled into hiding. They feared those who had been arrested for political reasons. To gain favor, they opened the jails before they left and set the inmates free. A group of prisoners released from the Petit Goave jail wanted to get out of Haiti before any order was restored, and they were arrested again. I was working in the water under the boat when Ingrid saw a boat with a small motor full of men crossing the bay towards us. It did not seem right, and I got back on the boat. The boat came into our anchorage and anchored much too close to us for my comfort. At this point, two things happened. Throngs of people came running out to the shoreline hollering, and our cell phone rang. It was Mano from Petit Goave. People were telling him that we were about to be hijacked. He didn't know how, just that everyone where he was saying it. With the chaos and racket coming from shore, we could not tell what was happening. Was this an angry mob? It was impossible to tell. The men in the boat were far too close and were watching us closely. I quickly fired up the motors and pulled that emergency pin on the anchor chain, letting the anchor chain with its marking buoy roll overboard. The motors were put into gear, and we were moving before the boat full of men had a chance to react. We stopped a short way out to prepare for sea, getting one of our runabouts secured for sea. A group of dugouts from shore were paddling frantically out toward us, and not knowing what was happening, we pulled further out from the bay. One of the dugouts kept coming toward us, waving. With binoculars, we could see that it was Joyce's grandson, whom we all knew well and trusted. He led his dugout alone approached us. Marin explained that the village had gotten word we were about to be hijacked. The crowd hollering on the shoreline was the entire population of the village who had rushed as a whole to the beach to help and warn us. The boat with the men on board was from the jail. Their plan had been to hijack us to get to Florida. The village would remove them. They were desperate that we not leave. Eventually, we returned to the anchorage. Many people were still waiting on the shore for our return. The men from jail were gone. It seems they had come to hijack our boat, but had no guns with them and were trying to figure out how to get onto our boat. They figured we had weapons on board, and the dog, who was barking at them, also had them concerned. We picked up our anchor buoy and winched the end of the chain back on board and reset the pin. For the rest of the day, the people from shore kept on coming out to the boat to check on us and assure themselves that we were okay and that we would stay. The men from backwoods began to keep watch over us from the beach at night while we slept. The problem, however, was not gone. The next day we could hear the voices of men in the mangroves next to the hillside on the far side of the village from the boat. They were hiding in the mangroves and hollering threats at us, calling me by name. They were back and waiting. I contacted the people of the backwoods who lived the closest to this area and explained my problem. I could not risk my family with these men being there. If they wished us to stay, they would have to get these men to leave. They went and dealt with the problem, and the men were gone. We were now in no man's land. There was no government, there were no police, and the only people in charge were the gangs. However, with Aristide gone, the countryside became more settled and the level of anger went down, and things were more peaceful. It was as though the people were waiting for the next step to happen. We all assumed that the U.S. military would be the next thing to happen in the country, and we waited for the invasion. In the meantime, it became safe to leave the boat and go to shore again. We communicated with all of the other missionaries we knew along the shoreline who had planned on leaving with us. It was agreed by all that the worst was over and we would all stay. We began working again. We brought our truck back into the village and carried on. Problems continued in Port-au-Prince, where most of the unrest was occurring. Chapter 50. The Cavalry rolls in. Psalm 119, verse 114. You are my refuge and my shield. I have put my hope in your word. We made the national news in Canada the week the Haitian government collapsed and Aristide was pulled out. My sister in Vancouver took it upon herself to make sure the Canadian government knew where we were and would look out for our safety. She went to the newspapers and to the CBC News Network, who called me on the sat phone to interview us. Most of the info they had was wrong, but my sister's goal was accomplished. The Canadian government knew where we were. The occupation of Haiti began. They started in Port-au-Prince, where things were still bad. At first, we simply heard that the U.S. troops were coming in. We knew that the Canadian government had found us when their big military transport plane came in low and slow over our boat, wiggling their wings to say hello. We were all waiting for the soldiers to show up in our area, and eventually they did. Karina and I were in our truck. We had been to the Happy House to see Free Ed. We had left Ed's place and were heading back to the main road when a rapidly moving, heavily armored U.S. Army scouting patrol turned in and came down our road and spotted our white faces. I waved, and they waved me down to stop. They quickly established who I was and then asked me to fall in and follow them in my truck. They circled the vehicles with all weapons manned and aiming outward and brought our truck into the middle. They had pages of questions that we went through. They were a U.S. Army unit out making an initial patrol in the area. They knew they had problems to deal with armed gangs in the area. Did we know of them? After learning what they needed, they moved on. A day later, my cell phone rang with a restricted number. It was a U.S. Army intelligence, and they were being very secretive. Was I the one who met the patrol yesterday? Could I meet them in an hour at the same spot? I was off again, but this time I stopped to get Ed and Mano. We went to the same field, and the soldiers were there waiting. Gangs were on their mind. Mano knew who the local gang leader was, and we agreed that we would meet with the gang leader to organize a meeting between the military and the gang boss. We did this, and the next day the meeting was on. It was a strange thing to be in the middle of, but because we were the only ones the Army knew of in the area, we were in. The captain met with us and little Joseph, the gang leader. He was a little guy, as his name implied, and he was young. He barely looked to be in his 20s. The Army captain emphasized that they were not the enemy. They were here to restore peace and order. They were wanting assurances from Joseph that he and his associates would cooperate. Joseph's concern was that they were currently keeping the peace now. If they stepped aside before the military was in position to take control, there would be chaos again. What Joseph really wanted was some sort of status. The U.S. Army captain made it clear that Joseph would have to step away from any control or involvement, but thanked him for helping maintain order up until this point. With Joseph's ego intact, they reached a truce that day. When the military arrived and established control, Joseph and his people would step aside. The past was the past. The military didn't want snipers shooting at them, as was happening at Port-au-Prince, and Joseph did not want to face off against the might and firepower that the patrol had been displaying in town that day. The patrols became regular, and U.S. Army and Marine helicopters passed through on patrol regularly as well, often hovering around the boat to check on us and make it clear to all that we were under their protection. Then the day came. The Canadian Armed Forces set up a long-term outpost in Tigua, using the abandoned police station as their base. The U.S. Army patrols traveled in armed Humvees. The Canadian military traveled in beasts called LAVs. They were armored assault vehicles carrying about a dozen soldiers inside, an armored compartment, and a heavy machine gun and cannon up front. They welcomed us on their base and treated us like royalty, giving both of our children special tours through their gear. Jordan loved that he could hang out in the gun turret. The U.S. soldiers were the first in and were all business. The Canadian mission was different. They were to establish peace and give support to the community. They wanted to know the people and build trust. Don't get me wrong, they were tough soldiers. The platoon had been in Afghanistan and would rotate back there again shortly. The sergeant we dealt with had 23 years in service. They wanted to meet the people in the surrounding areas. The people in the countryside were terrified of the soldiers. They ran whenever they saw them coming. We, my family, Free Ed, Mono, and I, got in the Army transport truck and along with a lav went on a tour where people knew us. The locals would scatter, but we would stop and get out to call them. When they heard our voices, they would come back. Slowly, we worked our way around the area, introducing the soldiers to the people. When they heard our voices, they would come back. Slowly, we worked our way around the area, introducing the soldiers to the people. The military had food aid that they were supposed to distribute. They did not know how to do this without causing riots. They had tried and had a disaster. We had a distribution system in place, plus a large school and strong connections to other schools in Petit Gove. The military came to us with the request that we take on the distribution for them. We were happy to do this. They showed up at our school, an Army truck filled with rice, escorted by an armored personnel carrier. The lab guys put on a demo for the local children of what the equipment would do, with the turrets spinning and cannons searching up and down. It was impressive how fast they could maneuver it. The soldiers were in the school, making friends with the students who were crawling all over them. They got over their fear of the soldiers after that, but were a little afraid of the lav. After the peacekeeping soldiers had settled into their role in Haiti and some level of peace was restored, we began to see an increased presence of the U.S. Coast Guard in their orange rigid inflatables, armed with 50 caliber mounted guns forward and aft. Our introduction to them was late one evening while anchored at Ibo. They pulled up behind our boat in the dark with floodlights on and introduced themselves. During our conversation, they discovered Jordan's fascination with MREs, meals ready to eat, that the soldiers all lived on while in Haiti. And they also learned his birthday was coming up. They left him a selection of MREs for his birthday dinner. Jordan loved the idea. Over time, he would get more MREs from the soldiers in Petit Gove. One of the things we learned from the Coast Guard was that a large part of their mission was to try to stop the flow of illegal drugs from Haiti to the U.S. Haiti was known as a major reshipment point. They kept a very close eye on boat traffic in Haiti. Anything moving at a good speed caught their attention. A few weeks later, we were anchored in Laoko. Free Ed, Mano, and I decided to do a quick surprise visit to our school in Apar to make sure that all ran properly when they had no expectations of us being there. We ran across the 20 miles or so of open water in the 15-foot ski boat I had gotten from Lamar. We were halfway across when the U.S. Coast Guard came screaming in at full speed. When they realized who we were, we both stopped for a brief visit, and then each boat headed on in its way. But it was clear the Coast Guard was keeping close watch. Life returned to normal, whatever that might be in Haiti. The U.S. forces had pulled the Haitian president from the country and had sent troops in to bring peace to the country in February. It was now summer, and we had been at this for 7 years. Chapter 51. 7 years. 2 Timothy 4:7. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Our 7 years were up, and our building projects were all completed. In fact, we had spent 9 years of our life to do what we did. 7 years on the boat and 2 years getting ready. To maintain the work that we'd begun would only require us to be in those areas on a very part-time basis. Free Ed was there and could carry on his own. If we were to stay in Haiti, we would need to move elsewhere and begin all over. The current circumstances in Haiti would make a very dangerous task. Another factor we considered was our finances. We had a long run and our supporters had been faithful to us, but we could not assume their willingness to support us long-term into the future. To start work in a new location would be another long-term commitment to complete the work there. The boat was another consideration. It was built in 1954, and over the last 7 years, we had worked it hard, and there were many things that needed to be done to it. I didn't think the boat would have 5 more years of hard service left in it without some major repairs and maintenance. My children were going to be turning 14, and it was time for them to return to a life in North America and finish their education. To ask them to stay on board for another long-term commitment was a lot to ask of my family. Our focus and recover from the last year in Haiti. The run to Georgetown was a challenge as we were towing the 15-foot ski boat we had gotten from Lamar. We had to tow it about 100 feet behind us in the open sea and hold our speed down to keep it happy behind us. If we traveled too fast, the towed boat would surf behind us on the larger waves and then turn sideways as the tow line went slack. The run to Georgetown was normally 40 hours nonstop. With the boat being towed behind us, we decided to break the run up and stop overnight at Great and Agua Cay off the large Morton Salt operation. We put the quarantine flag up and we were blessed by officials who came out to the boat to us and cleared us into the Bahamas. Great and Agua Cay was one of those rugged places memorable for its huge salt operation, but also for the open water anchorage that also left us feeling exposed to any unpredicted change in weather. During our time living aboard, a number of unique places we passed through or stopped at stuck in my mind. For example, the memory of coming into San Francisco under the Golden Gate Bridge stays with me. The sheer size of the bridge is appreciated more when one passes under it rather than driving across it. The experiences of coming through the Panama Canal is also one that stays with me. Again, the sheer size of the canal and what it took to build it leaves one amazed. On the extreme northwest point of Haiti, a small hook of rugged and barren rock extends out into the windward passage called Mont St. Nicholas, providing a relatively protected anchorage in the face of a very unsettled stretch of water. This was our last stop to sleep before heading out to sea on our way to Florida. It was also our first stop to rest on our way back into Haiti. The anchorage was 100 yards or more off the rugged shoreline. There were many coral heads in the area, so the trick was to find a white sandy patch that we could safely anchor in. It was a very unique place, and that was the last place we anchored in Haiti. Perhaps our most unique anchorage was a place called Hogsty Reef. The reef, about a mile across, is horseshoe-shaped with the open end facing west. At the entrance into the horseshoe is a very small, low island sandbar. This is the only part of the reef that rises above the ocean, alone in the middle of the sea, 50 miles from the nearest island. It is visible only because of the massive shipwrecks that litter the reef. We made a stopover there one night on a stormy passage on our way back to Haiti, and anchored in the lee of a wrecked freighter lying on the reef, a very windy and barren spot that made it appear that we were anchored in the middle of the ocean. The prize for the most idyllic tropical anchorage must go to the San Blas Islands of Panama. This is where we headed off from for the jump northward across the Caribbean Sea on our way to Haiti. Our anchorage there faced the open ocean with the waves breaking on the reef in front of us, leaving us in calm, protected water with an ocean breeze blowing over the boat. Behind us, a small sandy island had exactly 3 palm trees growing on it. It was like a postcard or a poster advertising the tropics. Portobello in Panama also is one of those picture postcard anchorages. It lies on the coast of Panama between the canal and the San Blas Islands. We anchored under the remains of a stone fortress that dated back to the days of Sir Francis Drake, whose men overtook the fortress by scaling a steep, jungle-covered hillside where exotic fruit trees now grow wild. When arriving in Florida each year, we had to arrive at the marina dock at a set time. This marina had strong tidal currents flowing through it, so the best approach was to arrive at either high or low slack tide and take advantage of the lack of current when maneuvering up to the dock. To time our arrival in Fort Pierce at slack tide, we would anchor on the edge of the Bahamas bank and wait for our departure time for crossing the Gulf Stream. I usually chose to anchor at Memory Rock. Memory Rock is just that, a rock that sticks out of the water. It was no bigger than our boat, but had a light on it and sat in about 25 feet of water, right at the edge of the bank where the bottom dropped off to thousands of feet. We would lay at anchor here waiting for the appropriate time to make the jump. I could have anchored anywhere on the edge of the bank, but I just liked the idea of anchoring by the rock. It was a familiar place, and it was the last place we anchored on our final trip back to Florida. After our break in Georgetown in the Bahamas, we finally arrived back in Florida in late August 2004. Our timing could not have been worse. This was the year of the hurricanes in Fort Pierce. On Labor Day weekend, Hurricane Francis arrived and parked itself over Fort Pierce for 24 hours. We had to run up north of St. Augustine to avoid the storm, and even there had high winds in the 80s for 12 hours at anchor. We returned to Fort Pierce to discover that the marinas were gone. The boats were sunk, and it was a major disaster area. There was no power in many places for weeks. We found secure moorage for the boat near Melbourne. When the power was just coming back on in Fort Pierce a few short weeks after the first storm, Hurricane Jean came through Fort Pierce, finishing everything that the previous storm had left. The boat was safe in Melbourne, and we spent the storm in a house with a friend in Fort Pierce. It sounded like a freight train rolling through the house, and we could hear the roof from across the street hitting our walls outside as it came off. In the Fort Pierce area, the marinas were all gone. For the remainder of our time with the Tinker Navigator, we anchored in the Indian River until it was sold on eBay. The new owners moved the boat to Galveston, Texas. I went as far as Sarasota with them. We took the Inland Waterway Canal, crossing through Lake Okeechobee to the Gulf, teaching them all that I could along the way. Standing on the dock in Sarasota as the boat pulled out to sea without me was a hard day. We returned to visit Haiti a year or two later. I have to admit that walking through it all with fresh eyes left me in awe over what God had done through us. Fred is still there. His dedication to Haiti amazes me. The schools are still operating. The children are still being fed, and life is carried on with Fred running everything. After we left Haiti, the business of kidnapping became extreme. Taitu was delivering Samuel to a place in Port-au-Prince and took a shortcut. They were hijacked, and in the shuffle, Taitu was shot in the arm with a shotgun and left on the street to bleed. Samuel was kidnapped, and someone eventually took Taitu to the hospital where they removed his arm, but he survived. Some churches in Florida raised money and paid the ransom to get Samuel released. Later, after he recovered from the gunshot wounds, a group of men broke into Taitu's house late at night, and he was kidnapped. The money was raised for his ransom, and he was released. Taitu carried on in Haiti and one day fell off the roof where he was working. He was found dead on the ground. It is not known whether he fell to his death or had a heart attack or stroke. Either way, he was gone. Pastor Samuel got a visa to move to Florida and left Haiti. It breaks my heart that the best people leave Haiti, but having lived in Haiti for 7 years, deep down in my heart, I can understand the desire to get out. Pastor George was diagnosed with prostate cancer back around 2000. He kept serving God in Haiti and then later in the Dominican Republic. He went to be with the Lord in 2008. His son Charlie had carried on in Haiti, and the mission has continued to thrive. I had lunch with Fred a while back here in Florida. It's been almost 14 years since we left, but he says the people still talk of us and ask if we will return one day. If you recall from earlier in this story, on my last day in Vernon before moving on to the boat, God showed me that we were doing this for one person. He never told me who that was. It may have been someone who we impacted along the way. There were many. When I think about the possibilities, a number of people come to mind. The first thought is always Joyous Gene, the former voodoo priest. His conversion changed the whole village. Joyous died a year later after we left Haiti, at a ripe old age, well into his 80s. He stayed loyal to Christ until the end. When my day comes and I am called home, he will be among those who meet me at the gates. I would not trade the years in Haiti for anything. There are so many people that still come to my mind daily and weekly. Those that helped us and those that God touched through us. During the years that I walked with God in Haiti, He taught me how to love. He taught me how to stand firm with Him regardless of the storms around me. And He taught me how to give. He literally brought me through the storm, and until the end, I know I am His. So who was the one He wanted to change? In my heart, I believe that of all the people that He changed, it was me that He changed the most as we walked together through those years in Haiti. Is it possible that He did it all for me? That would be just like Him, wouldn't it?